Hello, welcome to Chapter 11, Fundamentals of the Nervous System and Nervous Tissue. So this first video. I think I have 4 videos for this chapter. So this will be an overview of the nervous system. So let's see. Oops. I want to make sure my little pen works. Okay, so let's take a look at this cartoon. So here's a glass of water. The information, the light information about the glass of water is going into your eyes, and it shows this blue neuron and its axon doing sensory input. So sensory information about that glass of water goes into your brain, and actually the area for vision is in the back of your brain. And this blue neuron synapses with this green neuron. So here's the cell body of the green neuron. Here's the axon of the green neuron. And then and that's called an interneuron. And then that interneuron will synapse with the pink motor neuron. So here's the cell body of the pink motor neuron. Here's the axon of the pink motor neuron. And you can see it goes out to your biceps muscle. And we did this last chapter in chapter 9. So that information will go to a neuromuscular junction, and a whole bunch of cool biochemistry happens. And yay, you get to drink your water in Tucson, Arizona. So sensory input then is information gathered by sensory receptors about the internal and external environment. So and we'll talk about this when we do the eye special senses. So there will be receptors in the retina that will be sensory input, that will allow sensory input into your eye. Integration then is done by these green neurons, or the interneurons. So that's how you interpret the sensory input. So how do you interpret this glass of water? And then the third part of this nervous system series of events is the motor output, where you activate effector organs. And in this cartoon, the effector organ is a muscle, but the effector organ could be a gland that causes you to secrete. So here's a flow chart from Marieb detailing the CNS and the PNS. So CNS stands for central nervous system, and that includes the brain and spinal cord. And then PNS is the peripheral neuron, and that includes the cranial nerves. So the nerves coming out of the brain, not the brain itself, but the cranial nerves, and then the spinal nerves would be the PNS. So here's a cartoon of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the PNS, we're going to fill in all these boxes one at a time. But if you look at the key here, the blue lines are going to be sensory divisions of the peripheral nervous system, and the red lines are motor divisions of the peripheral nervous system. The sensory division, that's where you sense things. So let's take a look. Here's this blue line. Here's your skin. Remember this cartoon from the integumentary system. And there are sensory receptors in your skin that will deliver sensory information to the central nervous system. And then here's a sensory afferent neuron, because sensory neurons are also called afferent neurons. Motor neurons are also called efferent neurons. But here's one coming as a sensation from your stomach, perhaps that you're full. And then the red lines will be motor divisions of the motor efferent part of the nervous system. And you can see here's a motor neuron going out to a muscle cell, and it would be at the neuromuscular junction. Here's a motor neuron going out to the heart, and here's another one going out to your bladder. So the central nervous system, like I said, includes brain and spinal cord. The central nervous system contains these things called tracts. Tracts are structures that axons of neurons run in, and then nuclei. This is a little tricky because like a nucleus is where the DNA is in the cell, but a nuclei in this, or a nucleus in the central nervous system, is a collection of cell bodies of neurons. Also in the central nervous system, you have the command centers. Obviously, that's where you send out commands from. And then the peripheral nervous system, that's over here, all this stuff in yellow, contains nerves and ganglia. But here's the trick. Nerves in the peripheral nervous system contain the same things that tracts contain in the central nervous system. So both tracts and nerves contain axons of neurons, and then both nuclei and ganglia contain cell bodies of neurons. And then also in the peripheral nervous system, you have paired spinal nerves and you have paired cranial nerves. That means you have one of each. Well, we have one on each side. And these nerves carry messages to and from the central nervous system in the form of action potential. There's two functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system, but remember, we have a whole module dedicated to the peripheral nervous system. So this is just an overview, but there's two functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system. That's the sensory afferent division. That's where you're sensing things in the periphery and that you're sending that information about what you sensed to the central nervous system. And then the motor efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And that's where the central nervous system sends out commands with these red motor neurons to effectors in the peripheral nervous system. So some details about the sensory, aka afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. The cell bodies of all the neurons in the sensory afferent division are located in these structures called ganglia, and they're outside the central nervous system. Somatic afferent fibers, so somatic means body, so somatic afferent fibers can convey impulses. Remember, impulses are also called action potentials. Convey action potentials from the skin, so here's the skin, from skeletal muscles, from joints, and they send that information about the state of the skin, the skeletal muscles, and the joint. They send that information via sensory afferent fibers to the CNS. Those are somatic afferent fibers, but then there's also visceral afferent fibers. They also convey action potentials to the central nervous system, but visceral afferent fibers convey information from the visceral organs, like the bladder, the stomach, the intestines, to the central nervous system. This is a really important distinction. Afferent fibers, oh yeah, let me back up. This is tricky because in this chapter, axons of neurons, so remember, axons are those long things attached to the neuron's cell body. Axons are also called fibers. So you gotta memorize 2 for 1. Axons of neurons are also called fibers. So these afferent fibers are axons, and they're sending information about what you're sensing in your skin, skeletal, muscle, and joints. Then you're in their somatic afferent fibers. If you have sensations coming from your visceral organs like your stomach, your bladder, and you want to send that information about what you're sensing to the central nervous system, you use visceral afferent fibers. And then the second functional division of the peripheral nervous system is the motor efferent, and that's all these neurons in red. And you have both somatic and visceral efferent fibers. They're transmitting impulses to their effector organs. So if you are sending out a signal from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle, then that would be the somatic efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And if you're sending out motor information, say to your intestines to get them to contract, then you're using the visceral efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And then let's make it even more complicated, shall we? There's two parts to the motor division. So here we are, we're over in this part of the cartoon now. We're in the motor efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. And there's two parts to that. There's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So in the somatic nervous system, that's under voluntary and conscious control. And somatic motor nerve fibers, that's the axons of somatic motor neurons, go out to, because it's a somatic system, will go out to muscles and joints, skeletal muscles and joints. And you have conscious control of your skeletal muscles. So they call this part of the motor division the conscious, somatic, voluntary, or conscious nervous system. And then over here in the autonomic nervous system, which we'll have a whole chapter on the autonomic nervous system. That's the involuntary or unconscious portion of your motor efferent division. So you're sending out unconscious information via your autonomic nervous system to your smooth muscle cells, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. And then, but wait, there's more. There's even more division in the autonomic nervous system. Can be broken down into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. You may have heard of these systems. The sympathetic is fight or flight, the fight or flight division of your autonomic nervous system. And then the parasympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system is rest and digest. And then this is just a whole cartoon for you to look at. Like I said, this autonomic nervous system, we have a whole chapter on that. So I'll just let you glance at this slide and put it on pause and drink it in. Okay, histology of nervous tissue. So in this cartoon, there's two basic cell types, but that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of cells with a whole bunch of different names that you get to memorize. But there's two basic cell types. The first cell type of nervous tissue are these neurons. We've been talking a lot about the neurons. We talked about them in muscle, and we've gone over them. We'll go over them in this chapter. But here's a neuron. Here's its cell body, and then all these projections coming off the cell body, those are called dendrites. And then here's the neuron's axon, and it's covered in this thing called myelin. So the neurons are excitable cells. The neurons are the ones that transmit the signals. And then the second type, the second basic cell type are neuroglia, or support cells. And they include these things called astrocytes. So here's a cartoon of an astrocyte. It's this, what is that? It's that kind of a teal. So here's the cell body of an astrocyte. It's the most abundant cell in the CNS, but it's there to create the blood-brain barrier. You've probably heard of the blood-brain barrier, but now you know the blood-brain barrier is a result of this cell, the astrocytes, sending out these projections. You can see these little feet. I guess to the early histologists, it looked like stars, so they called them astrocytes. But if you want to get out of a blood vessel, so this red thing is a blood vessel, if you want to get out of this, if you are a compound and you want to get out of this blood vessel into the brain, to the neurons, you have to get interrogated by these little foot processes on astrocytes before you can get into an area where you could contact a neuron. The other type of support cell or neuroglia is called a microglia. So this little guy right here, microglia, they fight infections, bacteria. So for example, these microglia can find bacteria that got into your brain somehow and destroy them. And the next type of support cell is called an ependymal cell. So here's an ependymal cell. And they're the cells that line the brain ventricles. So ventricle is just like a big container. So a ventricle is a container in the brain that includes, or that contains, the thing that it contains is cerebrospinal fluid. And these ependymal cells of the central nervous system line the brain ventricles and make CSF. CSF is cerebrospinal fluid. CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. And when we do the brain, we'll talk a lot more about how cerebrospinal fluid is made. The next support cell is an oligodendrocyte. So here's a cartoon of an oligodendrocyte. Here's the cell body of the oligodendrocyte. And then the oligodendrocyte sends out these processes that myelinate or make these myelin sheaths on the axons of neurons. So an oligodendrocyte can myelinate several axons. So if you see this oligodendrocyte right here, it's myelinating the axon of this neuron, and it's myelinating the axon of this neuron. And oligodendrocytes live in the CNS. Schwann cells, so I'm down here, Schwann cells myelinate a single axon, and they do it in the peripheral nervous system, not the central nervous system. Functionally, Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes are similar because they're both myelinating axons of neurons. So this is a cartoon that we'll go over. You don't have to know all this stuff over here. And we'll go over this cartoon when we do the brain and cerebrospinal fluid. But for now, I just want to show you where the ventricles are. So this is a mid-sagittal section of the brain, and it just shows you where the ventricles are. So these hollow things right here are ventricles. So here's a ventricle, and these arrows represent the ependymal cells making the CSF. So neurons, aka nerve cells, are collections of neuron cell bodies. In the CNS, we went over this, are called a nucleus. So here's a cell body. So if you have a whole bunch of neurons and all their cell bodies are in a space, and you're in the CNS, you'd call that space the nucleus. If you found a whole bunch of these cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, so outside of the brain and spinal cord, you would call that structure a ganglia. So, like I said, this is cell body. These projections off of the cell body are dendrites. And then here's our axon, and it's got the blue wrapping around it. That's myelination. Here's the axon terminals. You guys probably remember from muscles, that's where the neuromuscular junction lives. And neurons are interesting. They can live 100 years or more. They're amitotic. That means they don't do mitosis. So if you crush them or destroy them, they don't repair themselves. At least we don't think they do now, but I'm sure scientists will find a way to get them to repair themselves. They have a really high metabolic rate, so they need a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose. That's why when you're low glucose, low blood sugar, you can feel a little woozy. And the plasma membrane functions in electrical signaling. So the plasma membrane is covering this whole thing. The whole neuron has a plasma membrane around it. Okay, so let's look at these cartoons. This one over here we've looked at in the muscle section. So this is a trace of an action potential. So membrane, check it out. Membrane potential is on the y-axis. Time is on the x-axis. And it shows here the resting membrane potential in a neuron is -70, and then threshold potential, once the resting membrane potential hits this point right here called threshold potential, then you can fire an action potential. Okay. So And then this is my cartoon, as you can tell right here. This is a cartoon of a neuron. So here's the cell body. This right here is the cell body. Here's the axon. Here's the axon terminals. And then these little spiky projections right here, those are the dendrites. And it says that the dendrites are the primary site where a neuron receives signals from other neurons. So then check this out. These green things here are other neurons that I drew. So these little green spikes coming off the cell body of the green neuron, those are dendrites. Here's the axon of the green neuron, and here's the axon terminal of the green neuron. So dendrites, they're short, they taper, and they're diffuse. They convey electrical signals toward the cell body as a graded potential. So now let's look at this cartoon in a little bit more detail. We've talked about action potentials, but now we're going to talk about graded potentials. So let's check it out. Here, this green neuron, here's its dendrites of the green neuron. This black dot is the nucleus of the green neuron. Here's the axon of the green neuron. Here's the axon terminal of the green neuron. And it says the green neuron is releasing a neurotransmitter. Do you remember what the neurotransmitter was in the neuromuscular junction? If you said acetylcholine, well, you know, you're a genius. So let's say some neurotransmitter, it could be acetylcholine or whatever your favorite neurotransmitter is. There's this little ball here. So the neurotransmitter is released from the axon terminal, and this binding of the neurotransmitter to a channel, I don't know if you remember from the last chapter when we did muscles, this is a ligand-gated channel, and the ligand is the neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter has a name, acetylcholine. It's the example we're using. So this is a ligand-gated channel, and it shows that positive charges come into the cell. This is what, and then when the positive charges start coming from the dendrite to the cell body, this is what happens. Let's come over here and look at this graph. Okay, so let's check this out. So same thing. This is a graph of a graded potential. So here's millivolts on the Y, milliseconds on the X. Here's our resting membrane potential. Here it is. And then when these positive charges start coming in, it gets less negative or more positive. But remember in our action potential, let's go over the action potential graph. In an action potential, the membrane voltage changes to plus 30. That's an action potential. In a graded potential, when these ions come into the cell, when the ions come from the dendrites to the cell body, look at what happens. It only gets up to about minus 60 millivolts, and then it depolarizes. So this is the difference between, well, at least from a graph standpoint, the difference between an action potential and a graded potential. Now, it's not really on this cartoon, but if you came over here and you are this green neuron and you released a neurotransmitter that opened a chloride channel. So remember, chloride is negative. Chloride's larger on the outside than the inside of the cell. So chloride's going to come in. A bunch of negative charges are going to come in to the cell, and the graph for that would look like this. So you'd start here at resting membrane potential at minus 70. As those negative charges came in, the inside of the cell would get even more negative, and you'd have a hyperpolarizing graded potential because the negative charges are coming in. Okay, so we've seen the difference between an action potential and a graded potential. This is just our same cartoon, just adding a few more things on it. This part is really a cool part. It's called the axon hillock, so for little hill, and it's at the junction between the beginning of the axon and the cell body. So the axon hillock, and what lives in the axon hillock are a whole bunch of voltage-gated channels. So remember, out here on the dendrites, there are ligand-gated channels for sodium and potassium and other ions, but at the axon hillock, they're voltage-gated channels. So that if you have a voltage-gated channel present, you can do an action potential, aka an impulse. And then once the action potential is generated, it moves down the axon to the axon terminal. So sometimes an axon will branch. So I don't know why this isn't connected up here, but this axon could branch. You call that an axon collateral. And then at the axon terminal here, there's a whole bunch of these synaptic knobs or terminal branches. This is information that doesn't look like it's on the test, but if you are sending not action potentials, but molecules and organelles out your axon, that's anterograde. And if you go back up the axon to the cell body, that's retrograde movement of things. So we've already talked about this. Bundles of axons are called tracts in the central nervous system, and they're called nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So here's a cartoon. We've seen something like this before. This is a cross section of the spinal cord. And you can see all these tracts. So for example, here's a dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Here's a ventral spinocerebellar tract. So all these little red patches here, they're tracts, and they'll run up and down the spinal cord in the central nervous system. And you can see over here that you've got ascending tracts are going up in red, and then the descending tracts are going down in green in this cartoon. And then this is a cartoon that just shows the cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves. So all these nerves coming out of the central nervous system, but they're in the peripheral nervous system, are called the axons of those neurons coming into the peripheral nervous system. Those are called spinal nerves. So nerves contain axons in the peripheral nervous system. And this just shows, here's the brain, and it shows some of the cranial nerves that we'll talk about when we do the brain. But so for example, there's a optic nerve. So that would be in the optic nerve right here. It's cut. That's the optic nerve. And so that would be a nerve in the peripheral nervous system. But then there's also an optic tract right here, and that would be a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. Okay. So our same basic cartoon, now we're looking at this blue stuff called the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath functions to increase the speed of nerve impulse or action potential transmission. And when we go into action potentials, we'll look at this more closely. But the myelin sheath protects and insulates the axon. It's lipoid, so that means it's fat-like, and you find it around most really long axons or diameter axons. And so here's the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system, how it works. So the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system is formed by a Schwann cell wrapping around the axon. So here's the cartoon of the Schwann cell plasma membrane. That's the stuff on the outside. It's a cell, so it has a plasma membrane. Here's the cytoplasm inside the cell. Here's the Schwann cell nucleus. And here's this yellow thing is the axon that the Schwann cell is wrapping around. So the Schwann cell, once it starts wrapping around the axon, it just keeps wrapping its plasma membrane around the axon in successive layers. And then as you wrap a cell around this axon, the cytoplasm is forced from between the membranes. So here's the the Schwann cell plasma membrane, but all the cytoplasm has been pushed out here to the periphery. So Schwann cells, they wrap around many times around the axon. And then it doesn't show it in this cartoon, but I don't think, but anyway, so here's one Schwann cell, and then there'd be another Schwann cell down here, and then there'd be this little node, this little area where there was not a Schwann cell, and they call that a node of Ranvier, and it's just a gap between adjacent Schwann cells on a peripheral neuron axon. Okay, axons, this is tricky. Axons are also called processes, and they're also called fibers. So an axon could be a process or a fiber or an axon. Okay, just a few more parts of our hero neuron. So this is what we've talked about, the axon hillock. The neurolemma is just that last layer of the Schwann cell wrapped around an axon. We've talked about the nodes of Ranvier. So here's the nodes of Ranvier between Schwann cells. All right, so that was the axon and the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. This is a cartoon of the axon and the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, the myelin sheath is formed by Schwann cells. In the central nervous system, the myelin sheath is formed by these cells called oligodendrocytes. And so this pink thing is an oligodendrocyte, and look, it sends out its processes here, and it wraps around an axon of a neuron. Of neuron 1, but it can also send out a process and wrap around the axon of neuron 2, where the Schwann cells line up and they only wrap around the axon of neuron, say, number 1. Okay. So there's myelinated and unmyelinated axons. So if we look at this top cartoon, it shows a neuron. So here's the cell body. Here's the axon hillock. It shows sodium rushing in a voltage-gated sodium channel, and the time is at 1 millisecond. After 5 milliseconds, through a series of opening and closing of voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels and the sodium-potassium ATPase, the signal or action potential has gotten to this part of the neuron. After 10 milliseconds, the signal has gotten to this part of the neuron. This is an action potential in an unmyelinated axon. Now check it out. At 1 millisecond over here in a myelinated axon, so you start here at the axon hillock. After 5 milliseconds, the action potential has gotten here. And after 10 milliseconds, look, the action potential has almost gotten to the end of the axon terminal. So if you are myelinated axon, you can conduct impulses a little faster. And we'll talk more about that in subsequent videos. White matter and gray matter. So in this cartoon, it's obviously the spinal cord, and you can see this stuff in the middle, kind of shaped like a butterfly, or some people say it's shaped like an H. That's the gray matter, and it's surrounded by white matter. And then here in the brain, the gray matter is on the outside. So all this, it's actually brown here, but this is the gray matter, and then the gray matter surrounds the white matter is on the inside. So in the spinal cord, the gray matter is on the inside, the white matter is on the outside. In the brain, the gray matter is on the outside, and the white matter is on the inside. So the white matter itself is really a very dense, all this stuff is dense connections of myelinated fibers. And if you look at this cartoon really closely, you can see a bunch of tracks in there. So myelinated axons, aka fibers. And then the gray matter is mostly neuron cell bodies, and then unmyelinated fibers. So there's 3 types of neurons. The first one is a multipolar type. So let's check it out. Here's a cell body, and then it's got a pole here, it's got a pole here. Here's another neuron. Look at its shape. Here's its cell body. It's got a lot of dendrites on it. So multipolar is one axon and several dendrites, and you find those mostly in the CNS, in motor neurons and interneurons. The second type of neuron is a bipolar neuron. You have one axon and one dendrite. So here's the cell body, here's the one dendrite, here's the one axon, here's the cell body, here's the one dendrite, and here's the one axon. The next structural type of neuron is a unipolar neuron. And they call it unipolar because here's the cell body, and look, there's just one projection off the cell body, but then it does branch into a peripheral axon and a central axon. So the sensory neurons, those are ones that sense things in the environment, whether it's internal or external environment. They're sensory, remember they're sensory afferent neurons. They transmit impulses from sensory receptors toward the CNS. So for example, your retina senses light. And sensory receptors the type of sensory receptors are usually unipolar and bipolar. Motor efferent neurons and the interneurons are usually multipolar neurons, so we looked at that. And then this is just a table that gives you the classification and where you can find them. So for example, let's check it out. Here's the bipolar neuron. They're rare. You find them in some special sensory organs like the eye. So you find bipolar neurons in the eye, you find them in the ear, and then the olfactory mucosa, that's in your nasal epithelium.